Yo, not here with another discussion video, of course, with the TBC announcement in mind. For me personally, I thought the announcement was actually a little bit odd with the whole three-person reminiscing format. It actually threw me a little in terms of interpreting the actual sentences they were saying to actually reflect announcements in my mind, because it was so casual. I thought it was a little bit weird, but with that said, let's still go through them. And I wanted to point out some things that are important as consequences, and of course just gloss over sort of the important points and what they might mean in a loose sense, which may be a little bit obvious to some of you, but we're also going to dig a little bit deeper as well. As a little disclaimer though, I'm going to dip and dive between positive and negative to avoid having just big chunks of positivity and negativity. So let's start with the release schedule. And the first thing I have to say, or was planning to say until we got the Day 2 announcement, is thank Leatherworking that Phase 1 only contains Tier 4 PvE content. Tier 4 and Tier 5 together was what it was looking like, based on the PR leaks and stuff, and that would have made so many profession items not worth crafting. It would have made Tier 4 raids in general mostly an afterthought. There's a few chase items like Dragonspine Trophy from Gruul, but overall it would have been a really disappointing experience for Tier 4, at least broadly speaking. So it's very positive news that they've decided to actually phase it differently. Let's touch now on a positive though. At least it's a positive in my book, but I know it won't be popular with everybody. The Paladin Seals being both factions. To my mind, this is more a victory for faction populations being healthy, but it's also great, of course, to see Alliance Ret Paladins will be able to compete with their Horde counterparts. I know some outliers exist in terms of the realms, but overall I think if the balance is somewhat good now, there's a good chance that it's going to remain that way in TBC because of this quite impactful change in terms of alluring a certain community, i.e. the people that want to play Ret Paladins, to split more evenly across factions, at least in theory. On top of this though, a consequence is going to be that Ret Paladins do significantly more damage across both factions, because we know seal twisting will exist, which was already a big boon for both factions, but now Alliance will be able to weave Seal of Command with Seal of Blood, just like Blood Elves in terms of the seal twisting, and this means that Ret Paladins are going to be even more secure in that one spot that they have for both utility as a melee damage spec. Now, the reason this is important though is because I was speaking to many people who I would consider very meta, and they were very low on giving that retribution spot up. They were more keen to try and involve an improved exposed armor rogue, whilst not really relying on a prot warrior, or just letting the prot warrior not use devastate to its full potential. However, with the seals being both factions and seal twisting being present, I think we're going to see a pretty slam dunk spot for Ret Paladins, even if you're pushing really high up into speed running and stuff like that. Moving on to a more of a grey area, but I think it will lean towards a negative for many. A single paid boost up to level 58 per Battle.net account was announced. Now, there are significant downsides, of course. The botting issue has been well documented by creators such as Willy, and this announcement makes rebooting a botting operation after a ban way simpler. However, there is some logic to this service. Blizzard are a business, and in an abstract sense, it is important for the player base to allow some monetization beyond the subscription fee. The more money generated from classic servers, the more effort, at least in theory, that Blizzard should attribute them. And in the event that they don't, you're able to vote with your wallet and opt out. Now, I know that's not what many will want to hear, but some monetization is a necessary evil if we want some changes. On top of this, it does allow players who didn't enjoy vanilla to reintroduce themselves to classic servers without a big slog of leveling and being behind their friends. This is a positive, I think, because ultimately we want more players playing classic TBC, so it's a good quality of life change to that end, even if you're uneasy with the botting implications and the monetary aspect. One of the consequences here, though, is that the people that are keen to make gold, and don't sleep on this, there's a big community that are really interested in pushing their gold income. And these players typically have several Battle.net accounts, or at least licenses for their WoW subscription. And as such, they're going to have access to multiple of these boosts. So they're, I'm assuming, army of 60s that probably already set up to have transmutes and stuff like that in terms of profession cooldowns. They're now going to add a few more. So it's going to add another layer of profession cooldowns to the economy. So not a guaranteed effect by any means, but I think there is a potential for there to be a more suppressed value to these profession cooldowns, specifically with the actual materials that go into them having a slightly higher floor. Now again, this is more feelycraft because we don't have any data to back this up, because it will be a new phenomenon as far as TBC is concerned, but this is a logical economic impact of this change outside of any botting implications. On a positive note though, we did get confirmation that we're going to get pre-patch Draenei and Blood Elves. Obviously, I think many can agree that this is a great quality of life improvement for TBC Classic players, but it also provides something for us to do in the pre-patch, because I don't know about you, but I really have never enjoyed raiding in pre-patches for any new expansion. It's usually really weird and all messed up most of the time, so I like the idea of having a chill 4 weeks or so, leveling a shaman, re-experiencing the world with hopefully a bunch of other levelers, and of course for Horde players it's going to be Paladins instead. But you might be thinking at this point, hey, we know this, but what are the subtle things? Well, I'm assuming that AoE cap will happen in this pre-patch, which means mages are not going to be super hot at boosting, whilst level 60 paladins can't really go too much higher than level 42, 45 in a super efficient way. They kind of need that additional chunk of 70 to be efficient beyond that. So, ultimately, many players will be leveling the old-fashioned way. This means increased demand on weapons that are good for shamans and paladins respectively, based on faction as they level. Think level 15 to 38-ish blue two-handers that are good for shamans, because they usually level as enhancement. And beyond that, past level 40, you can look at slower one-hand blues that will help them dual wield up to 60. Whilst on Horde side, you're probably going to be looking at good two-handed blues all the way up from 15 to 55, 58-ish before those paladins get into perhaps some early dungeon gear or even raids if they can squeeze it in before TBC goes live. The same goes for armor and appropriate jewelry blues, but probably to a far lesser degree. The leveling speed improvements from gearing up your character beyond what its current level is pretty much all locked into the weapons. Armor helps, of course, but weapons are the big one. So take a look there, maybe for some profits. On top of this, because of all the levelers, we're going to have a large influx of materials from all the skinning, mining, herbing, etc. And they aren't completely dead when we get to TBC, especially things like Golden Samsung you might have heard of in terms of the healing elixir it creates in TBC, along with Dreaming Glory. There's also going to be some demand for all the ores based on jewel crafting and prospecting, etc. when TBC lands. So ultimately, you might want to keep an eye on these markets for potential flips in the future. If you happen to be one of those levelers and you're mining, skinning, herbing, etc., I would recommend holding on to those materials if you've got the bank space until the initial influx has happened and the prices aren't super depressed. So let's cut now to one of the more later announcements that happened in day one. And I did leave this one to last because I did see some level of outrage, at least on the Discords that I had a peek at after I woke up. And that's the paid character copy to permanent vanilla realms, so that you can play both TBC with your main character and have its vanilla progress saved. I personally love this, to be honest. I do think it's a tiny bit lame that they didn't offer one free copy per Battle.net. That would have been a nice gesture. But you've already heard that I firmly believe some degree of monetization is a necessary evil to ensure we have continued support of Classic. And quite frankly, I do think it's a very non-disruptive way to monetize, whilst also offering a useful but ultimately not necessary service. Because most people that are going to save their character and play TBC, they're going to be using that level 60 more of like a showcase kind of trophy character, which I completely understand, by the way, but it's not a necessary thing, right? If you're desperate to play vanilla, you could just level a new character for TBC and save that vanilla main. So it's more of a superficial service, but helps generate revenue to continue classic server support. So for me, I think it's a great compromise between players and business, because put it this way, if we got something like faction changes, which are like 40-50 euros in retail, implemented into TBC, that would be far more impactful and disruptive to what we already have. Now finally, they snuck into day 2 that drums are likely to be changed ahead of TBC Classic, and I'm sure this one is super popular, and essentially the impact for many specs is that enchanting and to a lesser extent dual crafting become more common because they are often very efficient profession choices for performance. They're nowhere near as good as drums were, so they're not mandatory, so you're not losing much if you don't go these options. That said though, many will. So I'm assuming dual crafting levelers are going to be more frequent upon release, so the gem and ore flips that some of you might be doing will perhaps be more profitable. It also pushes leatherworking up as a gold making profession, I think, because it becomes quite underwhelming performance-wise for many specs. There will be a far smaller amount of leatherworkers than we would have had, of course, and typically leatherworking is really unpopular in most expansions. Look at vanilla. If you try to get a leatherworker's service, it's far harder than, say, an enchanter, an engineer, etc. There's a lot more popular options. However, tanks, hunters, melee specs will want leg enchants from leatherworkers, so there'll be quite a lot of demand and not too much supply for these crafting services. So if you're all about the gold, you might want to consider a leatherworker just for the sake of selling leg armors. I think that's everything that came to mind based on the information so far. I'd be very interested to hear your thoughts on these announcements though, and how they might impact your gameplay experience and perhaps how you intend to play the game. With that said though, I will see you next time, hopefully in your notifications.